great to have you all here today. Thanks very much for being here. I'm John Holler, the CEO, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon on behalf of our trustees, our staff, our members, and our more than 200 amazing volunteers, many of whom I see in the audience. So thank you especially for being here today. Thomas Edison was an American original. He held 1,093 patents in his lifetime in everything from botany to the phonograph. No other American inventor has more. His collected papers at Rutgers University number 5 million pages. Scholars have been working on them since 1978. His final laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey occupies 21 acres and is now a national park. On exhibit there, among other things, is his personal desk. It includes a pigeonhole labeled New Things, which is crammed full of papers and notes on ideas he never got to. We can know what at least one of those ideas might have been because near the end of his life he said, "I'd put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't have to wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that. I wish I had more years left." Perhaps Edison contributed to us the next best thing. It's described by historian Ernest Freeberg in his brilliant new book, The Age of Edison, Electric Light and the Invention of Modern America. While the electric light is not a natural subject for the Computer History Museum, I've invited Professor Freeberg to have today's conversation because of his profound observations about the nature of invention and inventors. The lessons that he draws out speak across the decades to a time and place here and now in Silicon Valley where Edison's approach and the success it produces are quite familiar. And in both cases, the world has changed forever because of it. Ernest is a distinguished professor of humanities in the history department of the University of Tennessee, the author of 2 other books and the winner of numerous prizes. His documentaries are heard on public radio and he lectures frequently for the Organization of American Historians. Please join me in welcoming Ernest Freeberg. Welcome to the museum.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
We're thrilled to have you here. Let's talk about what the book is not. What the book is not is, first of all, a biography of Edison.
Right.
It's not a discussion of the invention of electricity. It's not a discussion of the competition between Edison and Tesla, which is a favorite subject around here. But we're not going into that today. But what it is, and what I love about it, is it's a social and to a great extent also a technological history of the incandescent light and the enormous impact the lighting of America had on our society and on the world.
That's right, and I think it's in many ways a foundation of the modern economy that we live in and shaped our lives in ways that are often invisible to us just because the light is so ubiquitous.
Did you have a theory about Edison going into this project?
Well, I think I began with the premise that shows up in our textbooks that Edison was the inventor of the light bulb. I was not so much interested in Edison's role as I was in sort of what happens when the light bulb leaves his laboratory and goes out into, but looking at what Edison actually did, I began to realize that the actual story of his invention process was a lot more complicated and interesting than I had expected.
And you use the phrase about past examinations of Edison as often being, in your words, more hero worship than history. And while I want to get into the process of inventing in a minute, because that's a very important topic for us, why as a historian do you see it necessary to make that distinction?
Well, I think partly we need to understand how important it is for inventors themselves to turn themselves into heroes. That part of what they're doing when they're selling a product is selling their own identity. And Edison was really a master at this. People, gave him this phrase, the Wizard of Menlo Park, and he cultivated that very, very conscientiously. And it was a very powerful tool for him in order to develop funding and to get the world to trust him that it would be a good idea to put this powerful, deadly force of electricity into their houses.
And it did turn out to be a pretty deadly force in the beginning. We're going to talk about that. Back to this hero thing, too, for a minute. So there are parallels to the way that you talk about the evolution of Edison finally perfecting the incandescent light and the way that we often talk about the evolution of computing. as well. And you've actually spelled some of these out, and I just want to get you to talk about those for a minute. First of all, you talk about and debunk, really, the notion that most great progress stems from the single brilliant inventor alone in the lab, that,
right.
that there's a Eureka moment, there's this flash of brilliance, and that the innovation happens in that isolation and not so much in an ecosystem. All three of those things you take on early in the book, and you say, that's not really what happened. It wasn't true in Edison's time. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you learned?
Well, partly I think people long for that story, that great Eureka moment story. That's exciting, and it's accessible to people. It's a lot more complicated to understand the exchange of ideas, the competition for relevant patents, the battles over the marketplace. It's much easier to think of these great ideas as being passed down to us by a sort of Mount Rushmore of technological creativity.
And in the case of Edison and the light bulb, how did it happen?
Well, first of all, Edison entered very late into the search for a working incandescent bulb. And there were 5 or 6 other rival inventors who held patents ahead of Edison, crucial patents. All of them recognized the key elements of a vacuum bulb and a carbon filament. So Edison was entering into a crowded field, and he learned a lot from the mistakes and successes of his rivals. And many suggested he stole a lot of their ideas. Right? There was a lot of battling over the patents.
Who else was involved at the time, competitively trying to achieve the same things that Edison was trying to achieve?
Another fascinating character is Hiram Maxim, known for the Maxim gun. And he beat Edison to some crucial patents about how to treat the filament, and had a working incandescent light bulb in the field before Edison did. Joseph Swan in Newcastle, in England, also was working for years on developing a working light bulb, and actually put one into the field, lit his house, lit a nearby mansion, set up the first outdoor street light in front of his shop in Newcastle, and had a patent 6 months before Edison did. So there were many people converging when the big test of this was in Paris at the Electrical Exposition. And Edison won the day when he arrived with this, but he was there with 5 other people who also had working incandescent lighting systems right at the same time.
And were they all aware, as inventors might be aware today, of each other's work?
Yes.
And the progress they were making?
Yes. And there were at least a dozen if you go back. The first person to identify the possibility of incandescent light was Sir Humphrey Davy in 1810. And once he demonstrated that, people were trying to do this for years. And they didn't quite have all the pieces together. It really converged in the 1870s. But for more than a half a century, people were trying to create the incandescent light.
What do we know, or what did you discover about the way Edison felt about these other incremental stages of progress that other inventors were making?
Well, I suspect, like many other inventors, he had a real sense of rivalry. He announced quite arrogantly that when he entered the field that he had figured this out in a way that nobody else had. And his first big breakthrough was to suggest that they were all wrong because they were trying to create a carbon filament bulb, and he was going to create a titanium bulb. And when he announced this, stock markets for gas around the globe plummeted because people were so convinced if Edison says he can do this, surely he can. Turned out he was wrong, and 6 months later he had to say, I think I'm going to go back to carbon with the rest of the crowded field.
And as we get into the discussion of the technology, let's talk a little bit about a really wonderful phrase that you have early in the book, which is that Edison invented a whole new style of invention, that he almost invented the modern way we think of innovation happening.
Yes, that's often been said, that his model at Menlo Park was to create the first sort of research and development laboratory, where he often was very, very critical of college education. And was sort of proud of the fact that he was largely self-taught. But he knew enough to go out and hire university-trained mathematicians and people who understood the latest chemistry to help him in this project. He also had to hire technicians who could realize his ideas, a glassblower, for example. He needed somebody who was able to realize the various ideas that they wanted to experiment with. So it really was the entire team working very collaboratively, very intensively. But Edison was the guiding intellect. Many of them knew a lot more about their particular specialty, but Edison was the one who set the agenda. And also was the one who had to negotiate with the capitalists in order to get the money to pay for what turned out to be a very, very expensive research and development process. When Edison launched this, he called this an invention factory. And he promised that he was going to come up with a minor invention every 10 days and an amazing breakthrough every 6 months. He wasn't sure what those things were or what field it was. He was just going to create great ideas.
He just announced this to the world.
Yes.
It's almost like the Moore's law of invention. I'm just going to continue to roll these things out.
Yes.
Well, he had two other things. You mentioned one, access to capital, both from the public markets and from his own considerable wealth at that point, because he was making tremendous royalties off a number of other inventions, not least of which was the phonograph. And wasn't he investing a lot of that back into his own R&D?
The big chunk of money he made was from the telegraph, because he had started as a lowly telegraph operator, learned the business, and figured out how to send transmissions both directions on the same wire, which was a very, very valuable patent for Western Union. He got a good payoff for that. I don't think he made as much with the phonograph because people were fascinated by the phonograph, but they didn't really know what it was good for. It took quite a long time. People said this is his most ingenious but useless invention. People bought tickets to see a phonograph on stage, but once you'd seen it, what's it good for? And it took a while for people to recognize that music was the great use for it. Edison, being deaf, didn't think about the value of music.
Must have been thrilling to sit and watch a phonograph on stage play a cylinder.
Once.
And then the other thing that he had was a real commercial sense. He wanted to invent things that had commercial potential and really put them out into the market.
Absolutely. He was not a scientist. He drew very heavily on scientists. He did the thing which many American inventors were doing at that time, which was to borrow very heavily from European scientists, to take their ideas and find ways to make them much cheaper and more effective and put them into the marketplace and sell them around the globe. So that was very, very important. And Edison, very often, even with the electric light, he had to go out and was always frustrated with the lack of capital support. So he had to very often go out and create his own electrical manufacturing companies, for example. And he had to market this. He had to work out the aesthetics of electric light to try to convince people that this was not just going to be a more efficient light, but that it could be beautiful in ways that gas light could not be.
So let's talk about the technology itself and drill down into this just a bit. So talk for a minute about what was available at the time. What was lighting Europe, America, the average home, and the problem that Edison was trying to solve for?
Right. People often said that in the 19th century, people were hungry for light. People were moving into cities. The buildings were getting taller. Coal smoke was covering windows, and there was an enormous hunger for light. We see that in the spread of the whaling industry initially, the development of kerosene in the 1850s, and gas light from coal, which was an enormous and very heavily capitalized, powerful business. That was really what Edison was taking on. Everybody recognized that people wanted light, that they would pay an enormous amount for light. In the case of gas, that they would put up with terrible inconveniences in order to have the benefits of light. And Edison knew there was a market there.
And in fact, in the major cities, gas lights were actually pervasive, weren't they? I mean,
they were.
They were throughout Manhattan, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, yes. Baltimore, Boston.
Right. And it was a terrible technology. The gas had to be kept under pressure in large tanks, often kept in poor neighborhoods, and they would explode periodically and cause terrible destruction. The pipes leaked so that the soil, urban streets, the soil became terribly poisonous. People were very often asphyxiated if they didn't adjust the gas cock just right. And even when it worked well, it sucked oxygen out of the air. It heated up rooms terribly. And it replaced the oxygen with sort of noxious acids that ended up damaging furniture. If you were wealthy enough to afford gas light, you also had to be wealthy enough to replace your furniture every couple of years because of the damage that the lights were going to do to your leather bindings and fabrics and so forth.
So there was this tremendous hunger for an alternative to this.
Yes, and everybody knew that, and so they were, Edison was struggling in a market. Everybody knew there was a lot of money to be made.
Did Edison and the other inventors that you named, did they come to the incandescent solution naturally? Was that the first alternative that they felt really would be workable and marketable?
Well, Sir Humphrey Davy set the stage in 1810. He demonstrated two kinds of light in his experiments, and he was interested in electrochemistry. He was not interested in these as a commercial product. It was so expensive to generate enough electricity that it didn't seem viable until the dynamo came along later. So Davy demonstrated incandescence, but he also demonstrated the arc light, which was a much more powerful, bright light. Rather than using a filament, it uses two carbon rods kept just close enough so that the powerful current jumps across the gap and creates a light that's many thousands of times brighter than an incandescent bulb.
Why did Edison choose one and not the other to pursue as a way of perfecting this?
Well, somebody beat him to the arc light. The person who really lit downtown streets in America was Charles Brush, who was had a similar trajectory in his life. He grew up on a farm outside of Cleveland. Like many young men, he was largely self-educated. He had access to Scientific American and Popular Science Monthly and was hungry for this sorts of information. And he, following the magazines, figured out how to make his own arc light. Europeans were experimenting with this in Paris particularly, and he figured out how to make one that was cheaper, more efficient than anybody else had done before. So Charles Brush, when we think about the Great White Way, the broad lighting up of Broadway and these in public streets, that was all done by arc light, and Charles Brush really had not just the American market, but the global market covered very quickly.
Well, and the way these arc lights were deployed is amazing. You've got these illustrations in the book of these massive towers that were built in the hearts of cities, and they just bathed everything from a single tower, almost like a lighthouse.
Yeah. One of the exciting things about invention is good ideas that go bad, and this was clearly one of those. San Jose being a famous location for one of these towers. And because arc lights were expensive and because they were so brilliant, the idea was you could just create one single artificial moon above the town, and that would rather than putting a lot of lamps down low. And often when you erected one moon, you discovered that it cast terrible shadows. There were large swaths of town where it didn't reach, so you had to do another tower and another. Detroit was the sort of the high watermark of this idea. They had to put up 70 separate towers to try to hit every spot in town, and it worked so badly that pretty soon the towers started to fall down in the high winds, and they just let them go.
So the individual solution was the solution being sought after with this refinement that Edison and his other competitors wanted.
That's right. What they called to make the light divisible. It was one thing to make one massive light of many thousands of candle power. It was another to break that light up into little usable pieces that you could bring indoors. When they brought the arc light indoors, which they tried to do often at fancy balls or those sorts of things, the light made everybody look so cadaverous. Every wrinkle and gray hair stood out. So many people, after attending an event with an arc light, said, "I'm never going near electric light again."
Somehow I'm thinking of mainframes versus PCs here, but it's just us sitting in a computer history museum, I guess. Let's talk about the actual technology that enabled this to happen, because the key development of the light bulb itself was the filament. It was the lighting agent. So can you talk a little bit about the various attempts that were tried and what Edison's science was and his breakthrough on this?
Yeah, actually it's a very complicated system, and the filament was one of the missing pieces. Everybody recognized that carbon was the right element to use, that it would incandesce at very high temperature. But you also needed to have a vacuum bulb, and many people tried to do this, and it was really late developments in the improvement of creating a vacuum that allowed a lot of these people to all have a breakthrough at the same time. You also needed a dynamo to provide a steady current of electricity at a reasonable cost. So when Edison developed the filament, he was also working on the entire system. That's part of what made his system so successful, was that he was thinking not just of the missing piece, but of an entire integrated system that could go into the marketplace.
He did. He envisioned the whole thing from end to end.
Yes. Even the meter, right? He had to figure out how to charge customers, make sure they knew they were getting a good deal. So he had to invent a meter to put on people's houses so they knew that they were getting what they paid for.
Was this part of what made him unique? He thought in systemic terms about these big problems, not simply in the breakthrough that would enable something to happen in one point of the system.
That seems to be the thing that meant that he emerged out of this contest as the person we remember as the inventor of the electric light, even though he had many, many rivals. What he really did was figure out how to create a marketable system that he could put into the field and have some chance of taking on the gas companies for that market.
Let's talk about once he, and oh, by the way, before we go there, I just want to talk about his idea. He called it simply light. Right? His notion was that this bulb had to be extraordinarily simple, and it had to be something that any average person could understand how to use and could use very easily, and that the light itself would be so pure and clean.
Yes. Engineering, this was, in many ways the most complicated technical system that existed in the 1880s. But for the consumer, it was the on-off switch. Right? It involved no matches, no cleaning of lamps. In fact, you didn't even change your own light bulb. You would contract with the company, and they would send an electrician around to change the light bulbs periodically. Right? And so Edison recognized the fact that these extremely technical systems work best in the marketplace if you ask the consumer to not understand them.
To do as little as possible. Yeah.
Yes.
I just think that's brilliant. And there are local and modern examples of that all over the place.
Certainly.
So there were many doubters, but I want to talk a little bit about this famous showdown at the Paris exhibition in 1881 that you talked about. He roughly brought the incandescent bulb to life in 1879. Is that about right?
It was New Year's Eve, 1879, when he made a demonstration at Menlo Park. Right. He still had not perfected the system, but it convinced a lot of people that he had, because those bulbs looked great, but a few weeks later they were all burned out. He hadn't figured out yet, but by this exhibition in 1880, in the fall, he had something that could last much longer.
And by the way, what was that he figured out about the filament that wouldn't burn out so quickly?
Well, he knew it was carbon. He had very much an inductive approach where he would try anything. He's famous for saying, well, I've failed a million times, and that's fine because I learned something each time. So he tried beard hair and fishing line and cork, whatever carbon element he could find, and he stuffed his laboratory full of every possible element, not knowing what might work. And he finally locked in on loops of bamboo filament. And when he decided that bamboo was going to be the key to his initial success, he hired, with great fanfare, 3 explorers and sent them around the globe to go find the best form of bamboo filament. It was a great form of publicity for him, especially when the explorer who went to Latin America never came back. Just disappeared. But the one who went to Japan found a species of bamboo that seemed to make the most consistent fiber. So those early breakthrough bulbs were a bamboo fiber.
I just love that story. I mean, it just shows the extent to which he was determined to spare no expense and also to get the perfect solution. Yes. And at the same time made it a public relations coup.
Yes.
Yeah. So speaking of that, let's talk a little bit about what he did in Paris. I just want to read what you write in the book about how he set up his demonstration at the exposition. And as you said, there were lots of people in Paris who were trying to show off their approach to electric light. So he built a 220-ton generating machine.
Right, the Dynamo.
The Dynamo. He shipped it from America to Paris. He designed a giant display in the Grand Hall, I love this, with two massive electrified E's, showing E for Edison, obviously, and an electrified portrait of himself. And in a giant exhibition filled with lighting displays from throughout the world, only Edison won the Gold Medal of Honor for electric lighting. This was a marketing and public relations master stroke.
Yes. Now, in fairness, he did have the better system in the sense that he brought there a much more complex, elaborated system. The Dynamo that he brought, the 220-ton jumbo Dynamo, as it was called, was more efficient than anybody thought possible at the time.
Why was that?
He had certain insights into the construction of the Dynamo, took it apart and reconstructed it. And he also had a big breakthrough with the filament, that he recognized the fact that it needed to be a high resistance filament, which was sort of counterintuitive for reasons that I don't quite understand, but it was counterintuitive to electrical experts at the time. And that proved to be the stroke that made his much more efficient than others. So partly he did win fair and square, but he also had a great sense that this was about showmanship, and that winning the gold medal was going to help him ultimately win the patent war that was coming, and that if people were going to invest in this new technology, they'd want to put their money on the man with the spinning, revolving picture of himself.
And of course, Brush, you have this wonderful quote here, Brush is just crushed by this. He says, look, I have all of these working bulbs out there. I had them out there months, maybe even years before Edison. Why is he getting all the credit?
Yes.
And no one knows me.
Right. Wherever Charles Brush went and set up his arc light, people said, oh, is that the new Edison light? Yeah, he hated that.
Was Paris really the knockout punch in the competition to be not only the builder of the most efficient system, really the best system to light the world, but also putting Edison once more on the map as the man at the center of it?
Not really. It turned out to be a very thick competition for at least a decade. There were people who found ways around Edison's patents. He had patent wars that went on and on about control of this technology. So really, in that period of the 1880s, there were 6 or 7 companies that were in the business that Edison was a rival with. Edison had an advantage because he had visibility, he had more capital than others, but he had lots and lots of rivals. And people were hungry for light, and so there was this sort of chaotic war in the streets over who was going to get the lighting contracts between all these companies.
And so Edison comes back to America, and what's the next step? How does he, over the next decade, how does this play out in his own vision for how he's going to roll his own system out?
Yeah. Well, partly he has to go into the manufacturing business, and he was always he always said, I just want to go back to the laboratory and be an inventor. But he felt as if he never got the support from his backers to just be free to run his invention factory. So he had to go out and create a series of manufacturing companies in order to create the product. He had to work with lighting designers to sort of think about chandeliers and various uses, using it in the theater. Across the board, he was trying to sort of sell all the ways that electric light was going to be better than gas. So he had to do that, and then he had to contract with local companies who were willing to buy his equipment and go into the lighting business. As it turned out, Edison made a lot of money selling equipment, but the people who went into the lighting business using his equipment found it much harder to make a living, partly because there were a lot of other competitors going after the same business.
Did he have a breakthrough that really was the instrumental moment when you could say whole sections of a city would be lit? Was it in Manhattan, for example? Was that the place where he really took his system and showed everyone what could really happen if you had an electrified view of the world?
Right, on the Pearl Street station in downtown Manhattan, obviously a prime place with a lot of major newspapers and his Wall Street backers, J.P. Morgan and so forth. So this was a very highly publicized place to show. But still, his system was decentralized ultimately because it was DC power. You know, we think in terms of the grid now, and Edison was thinking in terms of a grid, but it was a small grid. With his system, he could light about 5 city blocks, and then you'd have to have another system. So you'd have essentially the city would have to have a power station about every 5 blocks, and that was his model.
So let's talk about the social implications of all of this now, with electricity being rolled out, Edison's system and others being proven. You then talk about the specific changes that it begins to bring to modern life. Light is suddenly erupting on the scene. What are the first major things that begin to happen, especially in an urban setting where light comes to the average home?
Right. It actually doesn't arrive in homes, except for the homes of the wealthy, right away at all. You know, I think this is a common model where it's industry that invests first until the price comes down, and it took decades in that case for the average person to be able to afford electric light. So factories were early adopters, for example. You know, there was a lot of investment in these very expensive new machines, and so the possibility of keeping these running 24 hours a day was very, very enticing. For labor, there was a real battle. This was just at the point when labor unions are organizing to make the day shorter, and along comes a tool that seems to erase what they thought of as God's, you know, distinction between the period of rest and the period of work. Basically, the workday looks like it's 24 hours a day.
Completely changes the whole definition of the workday.
So there's a real struggle over this. The unions push for no night work. The compromise is that working night work, often laborers were paid more. And there was a real struggle over child labor. That was one of the things that those early progressive reformers managed to battle first, was not eliminating child labor, but eliminating it in the middle of the night, because there were an awful lot of kids working the midnight shift at box factories and glass factories and textile mills.
And how successful was this pushback by labor during this period?
Successful enough initially to create mostly just an extended workday, some extra night hours. It especially was important for the transportation industry, where it did create a 24-hour-a-day transportation delivery system. Up to that point, train travel was very limited at night, because passengers didn't want to trust themselves to a train that couldn't see down the track very far, for understandable reasons. There were terrible problems with ships at sea. The seas were very crowded in this period. New, very powerful steel-hulled ships moving much faster and also colliding into each other. So electric light made sea travel much safer in this period. And so things like freight depots stayed open 24 hours a day, making possible this sort of delivery system that accelerated the economy in this period. Many workers loved the electric light. You know, it clearly was dangerous to workers in terms of opening up the possibility that the workday would never end. But office workers, people working in any sort of skilled occupation, postal clerks, they were so happy to not be working under gaslight that they welcomed the electric light.
And safety, you spend a fair amount of time talking about safety in the book, not about safety of working with electricity, which I want to talk to you about in a minute, but just making cities safer, making neighborhoods safer. The fact that light could be brought not from a giant arc light like an artificial moon, but really to the street level.
Yeah, they like to call it a street light, a policeman on a pole. This was a way to open up spaces so that working people, when they got off work at night, could enjoy parks and skating rinks and toboggan slides. And I mean, it really opened up the city, made it available in a way that was inconceivable up to that point.
Now let's talk about the kinds of professions that had to be invented, because it's very easy to forget today that, as you point out in the book, there were no electricians, there were no standards bodies. No. Electrical engineering was an entirely new idea. There were no electrical engineers
right.
until this all started to come about. Architects building buildings with electricity and lighting in them, city planners, as we've been talking about. There was a whole generation of jobs that opened up as this phenomenon moved forward.
Right. I mean, Edison, one of the other things he had to do was create a school to train his employees about how to use electricity. And then there was increasing pressure on universities to develop the first electrical engineering programs. Many cities had what they called electrical clubs, where a young man who wanted to get into this exciting new field would pay a small membership fee and would get to hear lectures on a periodic basis. And very often they'd have a little laboratory room in the back where they could try experiments, that sort of thing. But it was largely people who were self-taught in that first generation, which produced an awful lot of safety problems. People were learning the hard way.
They really were. And the electrical connections, the lines that were being strung, especially through these cities, were not up on tall power lines like we're accustomed to today. They were, in some cases, not far above the average person's head, weren't they? That just strikes me as incredible.
Yeah.
Why was it done that way?
There were no regulations. There were, literally no guidelines for how to do this. This had started with the telegraph wires and the burglar alarm wires, fire alarm wires. If you've seen pictures of late 19th century cities with these festoons of wires sticking out of the poles. And
those presented no danger, really, to anyone.
Kids love to grab them and break them because they give you a little tingle, But once these arc light wires started to cross with those, it became extremely dangerous. And these arc light companies were unregulated. There'd be 5 or 6 of them in a given city looking for a market. It didn't cost that much money to buy a dynamo and go into the lighting business. And they just started to throw wires over people's houses and tack them to trees and nail them to people's houses without permission. Once you put those things together, people started to be electrocuted in very graphic ways.
And you have some graphic examples in your book too. A lot of your research was done with newspapers of the era, and of course they loved the stories about mules being tied to electrified poles and dropping dead on the spot.
Especially the newspapers owned by the gas companies.
But what were the other things that you discovered in the media's reporting of this whole phenomenon? Not the danger necessarily, but just the wonder of light coming to America. Talk a little bit about that.
I think my favorite part of the research was going back and finding, really at one point in every city, town, and hamlet across the country, there was the night that the light came on. And people would show up by the hundreds into downtown streets and wait for the flip of the ceremonial switch. There'd be speeches. When the light went on, there'd be cannon blasts. And in Cheyenne, Wyoming, the whole town broke into song to serenade the electricians, thanking them for bringing the gift of electricity. So there was an enormous sense of excitement, and people were very much aware that they were stepping into what they saw as a new era in the modern world when the electric light came on. Even though it wasn't in their homes, it was, for many decades, electric light was something that you visited. You'd go, you might see it at work, you might see it in downtown in amusement parks. It would be in the city square, but you'd go back home to a kerosene lamp or a gas lamp.
What was the social impact of that kind of distinction between homes that could afford electric light and homes to which it came much later?
Yeah. Well, it was often greeted as a great democratizing invention. I mean, the electric light was only it wasn't something that the rich wanted to hoard to themselves, but rather the value of it was only existed if more and more people could be brought online. So people, even though it was something that it was fairly expensive, much more expensive than gas, up until the 1920s, people saw it as something which was reaching down into the middle class and ultimately into working class homes. At the same time, it did sharpen a line between the haves and the have-nots electrically, especially in the growing division between rural America and urban America in this period. Well, these are the years when Americans moved from thinking of themselves as Jeffersonian farmers to thinking of themselves as part of an urban nation. And electric light really created a very sharp divide between the old world and the new one that was emerging. And you can see time and again in the the journals, especially farmers' magazines and journals, that they're very aware of the fact that somewhere out there, there are cities where people are staying up late and going to night baseball games and Coney Island, and there's a whole world that they're missing out on. So that distinction was there right from the start.
And what's happening to Edison at this point? Is he now being hailed as the genius of the age to an even greater level than he had been at that point, because now the democratization of light was making his own image that much greater?
Yes, it's an interesting story, however, because he was so committed to the DC power system, and that is replaced very, very quickly by the AC power system. Westinghouse takes over, and Edison himself, because he's sort of bet on the wrong horse, loses control of the Edison Electric Company, and it merges and becomes General Electric.
Ironically.
That's right. So he is really out of the lighting business within a decade, and in fact vows as he's leaving the business, he gets a very nice payoff to do this, right? And he says, "Oh, I'm going to take my money, I'm going to go back to inventing, and I'm going to come up with something that's so amazing that nobody's ever going to remember that I was associated with electric light," which didn't happen.
The spurned entrepreneur.
Yes.
Kicked out of his own company.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he continued to be remembered as the great expert on electricity, and spent the rest of his life as sort of a scientific pundit. Everybody wanted to know what Edison thought about whatever new technology came along, and he was happy to play that role.
How vigorous was his fight on this whole direct versus alternating current battle?
He's most famously known for pushing the idea of using the electric chair for prisoners as a way to discredit. He insisted, if you're going to do that, you have to use Westinghouse's AC system, because that's going to work best to kill people. And to demonstrate this, he would also, he had an assistant who would round up stray dogs, and any journalist who would be willing to watch, he would electrocute them in order to demonstrate this. Now, that's
a side of Edison we're really not that familiar with.
Yeah. Well, he was a ruthless competitor, as they all had to be. At the time, though, however, Edison thought that these people who were being electrocuted in the streets, they were dying from AC power from these arc lights. Edison felt that AC power was reckless, that it would discredit the electrical industry entirely. So he had a personal vested interest in DC power, which clearly clouded his judgment. But at the same time, there was no such thing as effective wire insulation in those days. Basically they would put cloth and paint on these high-powered wires and hope that would work as insulation. So Edison felt like, many people were very disturbed by these very public deaths that were happening in city streets. And Edison felt that if AC power continued, ultimately the public would finally reach a point where it was not willing to go forward with electricity. European engineers came to America. They saw the chaos of the wires. They saw these people being fried in the streets. And they said, how can you put up with this? Right? And Americans said, well, we have a lot more light than you do. It's a fair trade. We lose a few, but we have more light in the United States than all the rest of Europe combined.
I'm just looking at the questions that have been passed up from the audience. There's some really, really great questions. We just touched on AC versus DC. I'm going to ask you a couple here that start with the technology. Was the filament in the light bulb, was that standardized very quickly once the more or less perfect technology had been decided upon?
It was an evolutionary process. Edison's bamboo filament won the day for a very brief period. He had to borrow a patent, drove him crazy. He had to go into partnership with his great rival Maxim, who figured out how to use a gasoline treatment to flash treat the bamboo, which was really necessary to make it last much longer. But Joseph Swan, another one of his rivals, actually pioneered the idea of creating a cellulose paste that made a much more consistent filament than the bamboo fiber, and that ultimately replaced it. So this was an evolutionary process, a lot of people working on this, and it got better and better until finally it culminated in the metallic filament that was developed in Germany initially, and then pioneered in this country by General Electric, which totally changed everything in a way, because they were so much more efficient than the old carbon filaments. That was really the breakthrough that allowed electric light to really compete against gas. And General Electric said, "This is Edison's dream finally realized." And this was 3 decades after Edison launched his bulb, promising that this was going to be an abundant, cheap form of light that everybody was going to enjoy. It really wasn't until the 19-teens that, as these started to enter into the marketplace, and there was a similar entry price. If you had carbon filaments in your bulb, the electric company would provide them free and would come over and exchange the bulbs for you. But if you wanted to buy the more efficient bulbs, you had to buy your own bulbs. And so that slowed things down, the entrance into this. But it was so much more efficient that ultimately, within a decade or so, everybody switched over to metallic filaments.
You know, I think that's so interesting because, again, there are modern parallels there, that as transformational as a piece of technology can be, it can still take a very long time for it to get penetrated broadly, made widely available, made inexpensive enough for it to be accessible to many people. That was just as true for electricity as it is for computing, isn't it?
So in 1930, the estimate is that about 70% of urban homes were wired for electricity. So it took that long, that's 50 years, just to get the wire into people's houses. And that really was created by the building boom in the 1920s. Many people were very reluctant to retrofit their houses, to tear up the walls and install. So it was really new housing. By 1920, electricity was considered to be the standard.
That's actually, you touched on the very next question I was going to ask, which is, isn't it true that some people were actually afraid of wiring their homes? Isn't something that held this back? Does it have something to do with people just not wanting electricity to come in because of the danger that it represented?
Yes, although everybody recognized how nasty gaslight was, So in comparison, people saw electric light as safer and cleaner. But still, yes, there was a resistance to putting this deadly force into your house. That was especially a problem initially. I mean, the most famous story about that is that when Edison installed his first system in the Pearl Street station in Manhattan, one of the early adopters was one of the Vanderbilts and installed this. Rather than ripping up the walls, they would sort of run the wires up along just tack them to the walls. And it interacted badly with the metallic thread in the wallpaper and basically set the room on fire. Of one of his major backers. The other backer, J.P. Morgan, wanted one of the first desk lamps. So he ordered a specially designed desk lamp. It also had a short and actually burned his desk to cinders. Yet he remained an enthusiastic supporter.
A major booster, even after that.
Yes.
That's the kind of investor you want.
Willing to allow you one mistake.
Absolutely. The Edison's management style, I want to just touch on that for a minute, to the extent that you uncovered that in your research, because obviously he's at the center of this, but he had a factory that employed thousands of people, and his laboratories were populated, as you said, with many researchers, really brilliant individuals working under him. How did he manage that? Do we know much about how Edison took that task on in this context?
Right. Well, it changed as his industries became much broader. The period that I was focusing on, that Menlo Park group was a fairly small group. There were about 20 people working with him. And so he had a very personal, intense relationship with them, working essentially 24 hours a day. He was a famous napper. He would sleep odd hours here and there for a few minutes, but all night long he would be working, and his entire team was expected to be working with him. And almost all of them including many who knew a lot more about a lot of the scientific elements of this, always credited Edison with being the guiding spirit of their enterprise, that he managed to create a kind of a spirit of teamwork that most of them remembered for the rest of their lives.
One other question here that I was going to ask is this from the audience. The sort of mystical idea that this was fire inside a bottle. Did you run across that at all? That there were also people who were intrigued by that or who were afraid of that? Both here and in Europe, I think I've heard that story told. Did you run across that?
I did not. What I was struck by was time and again, journalists trying to explain to their readers what an incandescent bulb looked like. And they always found it to be incredibly beautiful. And they use a lot of organic metaphors. It looked to them like a droplet of fire in a teardrop, or an Italian sunset, or it looked like a flower, or and they were drawn really to its beauty above all else, and they loved to look at it. The problem came, you weren't supposed to look once you got the metallic filament, and that's a whole part of the story that I had not expected to find. Once the metallic filament came in, it was so bright that lighting reformers had to teach people to use lampshades. People said, why should I be paying money for a light and then put a top on it, and they had to say it's not good to stare at the light. It's good. Yes, of course it's uncomfortable if you look right at it. It's not meant to do that. And there were actually manuals that would show you, put the light here and cast it onto your book here. This is how you do this. Because there was a real concern that the world had become so bright that people's eyes were going to be damaged. There was a lot of complaint about this and booming business for oculists.
What was the most surprising thing? This is a great question. When you did the research, what were the things, or the one thing maybe that surprised you the most that you didn't expect to uncover?
I think it was the development in this later period of this movement of illumination engineering. In the early 20th century, people decided there was too much light, and the entire focus had been on maximizing the amount of light for the minimal amount of coal burned. And suddenly there was so much light that people began to think differently about shaping the light. And it's really at that moment that a whole nother level of invention of the electric light occurred, as these illumination engineers tried to work out the details of what each interior space that we move in and out of ought to feel like. So there was this is when window designers, for example, figured out how to use light in order to make different kinds of goods look as alluring as possible. And theater artists thinking about using these new metallic bulbs to create all sorts of effects that had not been possible before. And you get strange moves like in the 1880s, you could tell that a restaurant was very fancy because it was brilliantly lit. And by 1920, you could tell it was a great restaurant because it was very dark and they were burning candles. So we sort of move in and out of a vocabulary of light that was carefully worked out by these illumination engineers in this period. They had to think about things like what should a church look like, and Catholics had different ideas than Protestants, than Mormons about what light ought to look like to be sacred, and whether or not light belonged. Electric light was an intrusion on their sacred space or a way to enhance their sacred space. I found all these things something that I feel like we completely take for granted. We move into a room. Its lighting very often is carefully designed to make us feel a particular way, without us stopping to think about all the intentionality that was involved in that.
Well, new industry. This is a great question, one that I'm glad someone sent up. The friendship that developed between Edison and Henry Ford. You talk about that in the book a bit. Can you go into that? It was just fascinating to think of Edison and Ford existing side by side, bringing so much change to society.
Right. Ford deeply admired Edison, and Edison at one point mentored Ford at a crucial period in his development, encouraged him, and Ford was always grateful for that afterward, and really lionized Edison when he created his museum in Dearborn, Michigan. He not only gathered up everything he could find of the Menlo Park building and the equipment, but he even dug up the topsoil, Edison's topsoil, and carried it over to lay it there in Michigan. And toward the end of their life, they would go on long camping trips together, where they both denounced the modern world that they had done so much to create, and said, we're gonna get away from it all. The world's too bright and hectic, and we're just gonna go fishing. And of course, it became a celebrity event with a huge entourage, a lot of specially designed Ford trucks to carry all the camping equipment, and electric lights to go into every, so they couldn't quite let it go.
Yeah, yeah. Did you track that? Was that their friendship? Was that an important part of the social history that you were trying to tell?
Really more just part of thinking about a wide movement that Ford and Edison both participated in to suggest that maybe the country had gone too far in creating these artificial systems. That was really the part that interested me the most, I think. And Ford certainly did everything he could to cement that image of Edison as the great hero that we started our conversation talking about.
So we're coming now to that point where, as you said, Edison starts to reflect back on these things. And there's this great quote in the book when you talk about him going on these vacations. He says, "I don't want to be near electricity. I want an old suit, an old hat, a few French novels, and a fishing rod." It was as if he seemed to long for that simpler time, or he wanted to get away from the more complex age and just be himself again.
Yes, and many did. Many people were grappling with there were a lot of critics of electric light. As much as people were hungry for it, as much as it created these wonderful public spaces and made work safer and more effective, many people were disillusioned with the. First of all, they said this was a terrible trade. We have a much more beautiful nighttime, but we've made it a much uglier daytime. We've got these poles and wires and these ugly signs. This is why would we trade day for night? So many people were concerned about that. They were also concerned about the sort of psychological effects of people who said that people were staying up too late, the sort of things we know now about the disruption of the circadian rhythms and sleep. People are more energized by electric light, but they're also more exhausted by it. And I think many people started to be romantic about candles and the good old days of the hearth. The colonial revival movement I talk about a bit in the book as an attempt to sort of convince people to turn off the light and live with candlelight a little bit so that they can get more in touch with something that's been lost in the modern world. G. Stanley Hall, the psychologist, was particularly interesting on that, I thought. His argument was that God had designed twilight as a way to cultivate the sort of spiritual, creative side of human beings. That it's in that zone that people dream and contemplate, and that human beings were going to cut themselves off. As soon as it gets dark, we flip on the light, and we deprive ourselves of a whole zone, a whole piece of the human experience. And he studied children and felt like children who lived under too much artificial light became irritable and lacked a kind of spiritual dimension.
And did you find any indication that Edison at the end of his life was reflecting back on that at all, or was it always for him just about pushing forward the future, the next great thing?
Edison was right to the end, a great defender of artificial light. He said, you put somebody under an artificial light and they will improve. That this was somehow going to just make you a better person, more energetic, more, he never was clear on exactly how it was going to make you better, but he was pretty convinced that it would. So he was a salesman for electric light right to the bitter end.
Right to the bitter end. So he's been called the greatest innovator of his age. Would you agree with that statement?
He certainly deserves enormous credit, but really the book is designed, I think, to suggest the fact that the age itself is more interesting than Edison, and in some ways it's the age that invented Edison rather than Edison shaping the age. And Edison is obviously an important and figure, but in many ways he's important because he's representative of a much broader sort of enthusiasm about invention and a sense that human beings had entered a new stage in human history where invention is not just something that comes along once in a while, but that you can actually create a factory and just churn out new ideas all the time. Edison's, you know, important that way, but not unique.
Well, and that one final point is he created what you call a kind of expectation of perpetual innovation, and he didn't personally create it, but the sum total of this age was that we would then be moving into an era when innovation would just be something we would be living with day after day for the rest of our lives. It was an entirely new concept, wasn't it?
And Americans particularly embraced this. They were enthusiastic consumers of the new technology, but they also were very proud of their growing reputation as a nation of inventors, and considered this to be particularly an expression of democratic values. That if you educate people broadly, if you create an open patent system that encourages innovation, that if you remove barriers between workers and thinkers, that Edison seemed to embody the ability to do both. That this was in a sense America's gift to history. Not high culture, not literature, but things, material objects, great machines that the whole world wants to have.
And indeed, we did enter into that period of perpetual innovation, and it seems to be going right on.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Ernest Freeberg. Great book. Thank you.